Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 21st, 2020, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the 2020 Senate election night. So this video is actually a member-decided video. If you get the second tier or above in terms of the little join button right next to my subscriber tab, you can go ahead and recommend a video that I will go ahead and produce. I believe I'm pronouncing this correctly, but this was requested by John Putnam, who is a member on this channel. And yeah, so I think that this does actually deserve a little bit more attention than what I've been giving it. For the past couple of months, I've been characterizing Alaska as a safe Republican seat, and I truly believe that is now incorrect. I will say that Alaska does have the possibility of being a safe Republican seat, depending on the performance of Al Gross as a specific candidate, or I'm not necessarily sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I wouldn't see any other way to pronounce it, against Dan Sullivan, who was first elected back in 2014. Now, the Republican Party doesn't really view Alaska as much of a threat. They aren't channeling as much money as you might expect into the state itself. In fact, this is reported by Open Secrets. Yes, Dan Sullivan is the incumbent Republican, and he has spent more money than Al Gross, who has also fundraised around 50%. I guess 50% compared to Dan Sullivan's amount, but we're talking about an independent candidate who really has no political ties in the past. If you take a look actually at what he's being described as, an orthopedic surgeon and commercial fisherman, there isn't much of a political history behind that altogether. He's running against Edgar Blatchford, which is the 2016 Democratic candidate, or I believe not Democratic nominee, I guess Democratic candidate. Pretty well known, I guess you could say, in comparison, but it looks like Al Gross seems to be the person who is leading the overall primary in the state of Alaska. So they have a very interesting dynamic. They have the Alaska Democratic Party, Alaska Libertarian Party, and Alaska Independence Party, which all work together. So essentially they will have one general party altogether, but don't confuse the Alaskan Independence Party as independent necessarily. Yes, there are independents who run, but I wouldn't say that they are Alaskan independent. That essentially means they want to become their own country, take Alaska and leave the union, as I would put it. But there are a number of independents who run in this Democratic independence primary, mainly because they don't want to face off another Democrat in the election. Actually, let's go ahead and take a look at 2016. The last time there was a Senate election here, and there was an independent on the ballot, and a Democrat on the ballot, and a Libertarian on the ballot. Now they could all have run under the same ballot, and vote splitting probably wouldn't have emerged. And if that had happened, it is possible that Lisa Murkowski could have been voted out. And let's say Joe Miller had won that primary, that's how it would have ended up. But for this 2020 election, as much as I characterize this as a safe race based off of the ratings, a lot of them do consider it either safe or likely. And I'm actually going to go ahead and characterize this as straight up bet I would say it is a likely Republican seat. I will say that it does have the possibility of narrowing up closer to Election Day, but we have no concrete evidence that, number one, the I guess you could say, I wouldn't necessarily, I guess you could say monetary value for Dan Sullivan versus Al Gross. Necessarily, the Republican Party has the advantage in terms of fundraising, but I do want to see some more polling data that does indicate that as well. I do think that, of course, the incumbent Republican will usually have an edge, especially in a very solid Republican state. In 2016, Donald Trump had a pretty substantial victory over Hillary Clinton, 15% over her in the state of Alaska. In 2012, Mitt Romney won by around the same margin. In 2008, with Sarah Palin on the ballot, it was a little bit larger of a margin in the state of Alaska, but in 2012, narrowed up just a tad bit, and then in 2016, was around the same margin, just a little bit higher than where it was 4 years prior. And that largely had to do with the fact that Gary Johnson got around 6% of the vote, and most of those voters I could pretty either see not voting at all or just voting for Donald Trump on the election ballot if Gary Johnson was not in the race. So when we take a look at this Senate election, we do also have to take into effect that Dan Sullivan is also not as well known as Lisa Murkowski. You probably don't hear his name as much as hers, mainly because of the fact that she has a firm opposition to President Trump. Now, that's not to say the state of Alaska has a firm opposition to President Trump, but if you do take a look at the only poll out, which is from 2019 and from Zogby Interactive / JZ Analytics, not really necessarily a good pollster, but they do rate the state of Alaska, I guess you could say by these numbers, a lean characterization. It's a 5-point lead for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. While I do think that Donald Trump will probably trounce Joe Biden in this Senate election, the House election is also expected to be close as it was in 2018. Incumbent Republican Don Young, he defeated Alyce Galvin by not that large of a margin. Based off the 2016 numbers, it definitely narrowed up in the United States. Let's go ahead and see. The United States presidential election to 2018 House election. In 2016, Don Young ran against a Libertarian and a Democratic Party candidate. Again, they are now grouped under one. That was after the 2018 court ruling that allowed all these candidates to run under one primary rather than just a Democratic primary, a Libertarian primary, and an independent running on the ballot. So that's essentially what happened here. While I do think that the 2020 House election is also going to be pretty competitive, I don't think they included any of the polling data here, but they only have one poll done by Data for Progress. I really wish that they had taken an Alaska Senate poll because I want to see if this race is going to actually be close. I think a lot of the times we are going to probably take a look at Alaska and consider it pretty substantial that it's not safe Republican. It's a very solid Republican state, and the fact that it's even remotely competitive makes it very interesting and very a pretty notable topic to talk about, considering that we rarely ever talk about Alaska. I don't think the Democratic Party has too good of a shot here. Back in 2014, Mark Begich had the best chance because he was the incumbent Democrat first elected back in 2008, and it was by a narrow margin. Keep in mind, Ted Stevens, number one, was a very long-lasting Republican, and he actually was convicted on 7 charges of ethic violations and corruption. I remember watching 2008 election footage, and they were talking about the Senate race because it had not been called on election night until into the early hours of the next morning. So Mark Begich ended up defeating the Republican incumbent. And then in 2014, in what was supposedly the 2014 Republican wave in the United States Senate, the Republican Party gained 9 seats nationwide. Alaska was actually one of the more narrow races. While we saw Senator Tom Cotton, or at the time just regular politician Tom Cotton, running against incumbent Senator, oh my gosh, why am I forgetting his name? I know I just had it. Why was I about to say Asa Hutchinson? He's a Republican governor. It doesn't matter. In 2014, the state of Arkansas overwhelmingly voted for the Republican opponent, defeating the Democratic incumbent who was in there, not for too long, but, the factor of the incumbency does have a very large factor for the 2020 elections and all of our Senate elections, all of our House elections, as it did in 2018 and 2016 and 2014. I mean, Mark Begich, despite losing his Senate race, put up a really good fight against what supposedly was a Republican wave year, and it absolutely was based off of the election results. But if you look at the margins and you look in very solid Republican states, including Alaska, some of them were actually narrower than other states, which may surprise you. So when we take a look at this 2020 race, Dan Sullivan is absolutely going to be the nominee. He's probably going to face off against Al Gross, who I don't believe there's any polling data, unfortunately. I know that they did have data for his Dunbar, but that was done back in May and June 2019, so literally over a year ago. I really think that there should be some more data coming out here. I don't know if there will be. Once there is, I'll probably update you guys because I'm still going to characterize the state of Alaska as a likely Republican state. I think that the Senate and House elections will likely vote to the left of the presidential election or to the, middle, because there likely is going to be an independent candidate on both the Senate and House levels. So I guess you could say to the left in that sense. But I do think that they will not vote as Republican as the 2020 presidential election in this state. I think, number one, the firm opposition from a couple of senators nationwide, not only Lisa Murkowski, but she's a pretty notable one, Susan Collins. In some cases, they have made a name for themselves in their states, and that may pose an issue to the re-election bid. I don't think Susan Collins is going to get much help from Donald Trump in Maine, but Lisa Murkowski is not up for re-election until 2 years from now. She may end up retiring. You never know. But I will say that the attention that has been brought to Alaska because of Lisa Murkowski will probably benefit the Democratic Party. I think that a lot of people are going to try to focus on getting out the Republican Party, and they are going to have to focus on damage control. If Alaska all of a sudden becomes rated, likely or even lean, the Republican Party is going to have to rush funds to make sure that this race is solidified, because the Senate race in Alaska is just as important as the Senate race in Arizona, which is just as important as the Senate race in another state. These seats are all 2 per state, and obviously one is up in this election out of the number of states that are currently up, 2 in Georgia right now. Compared to the House elections, obviously if you're throwing more money to the Florida overall congressional Democrats, that's going to be a lot more impactful than if you send it to the one House candidate in the state of Vermont. But in the Senate races, the Republican Party is going to have to defend Alaska as much as they're going to have to defend another state. And if this one all of a sudden becomes competitive, money is going to be dropping from more competitive races for the Democratic Party, more realistic races, and they're going to have to send it here. And while Dan Sullivan does have the fundraising advantage right now, if the Democratic Party chooses to back Al Gross, I believe the Biden campaign actually classified Alaska as a competitive race. That means that they may be targeting this one, because we probably know that Al Gross is more than likely going to caucus with the Democratic Party. A lot of these times, these independent candidates, not just here but around the country, don't like to clarify whether they would caucus with the Republican or Democratic Party, because that's just essentially choosing a party, and then that's just how it would get all mixed together in terms of their the way they're described in political ads, whatever it might be. But usually an independent who's running against a Republican will end up caucusing with the Democratic Party. I remember back in 2014, Greg Orman was supposedly leading Pat Roberts in the actually, he should have been up this time around, but he's retiring, which is competitive. Wow, coincidentally, again, in this election. And just like Alaska is another Republican state that if they have to send funds there, they are definitely going to be losing other races that otherwise they could have been focusing their money on. So while I think that the state of Alaska will not be competitive on the presidential level, I 100% see it being competitive not only in the House of Representatives level. I think it'll be very roughly around the same 2018 margin, but I could see Alaska be competitive in the Senate election. Once we get some more conclusive data and we know exactly if Al Gross is going to be the Democratic independent, whatever they call it, a nominee for Senate, I think that there will be some more polling data out, and I can make a revised look at this election. But other than that, I think that this race is just going to be a pretty likely Republican seat. It is going to vote to the left of the presidential election, I can almost say without a doubt. Dan Sullivan is not Donald Trump. And also Alaska, with a bunch of other solid Republican states, does sometimes send independents or Democrats into the United States Senate or into the House of Representatives or into their state house, whatever it might be. In 2008, Obama lost the state of Alaska by 20%, but the Democrats won the Senate election. So that is something to go ahead and point out. I don't think that Joe Biden will be competitive in the presidential election again. I just think that the Senate and House elections will likely vote to the left, and I'm only expecting around a 10 to 15 point margin for Donald Trump. So technically, it's still considered likely, which is still a victory for the GOP, but they will probably have to start sending funds here sometime soon and focus on it a little bit more than what they're focusing on right now. I truly believe the Republican Party should be dropping some other races that are going to pretty much be absolute for the Democratic Party as we progress through the election. Colorado, Cory Gardner's a goner. Martha McSally, a goner. John James, as much as people would love him to win in Michigan, realistically isn't going to win that Senate race. So, as numerous, I guess, more and more Republican states become competitive on the Senate level, the Republican Party is shifting its money, its attention to other states that would normally be reliably Republican states. And that does have to do with the fact that, number one, Donald Trump is being firmly opposed by some Republicans, most notably in Maine and Alaska. The fact that he's bringing down Republicans nationwide. They can't ride on a losing president's coattails. That's not necessarily how it works. There's a reason why if he loses, that's very bad news for congressional Republicans nationwide, whether it's the Senate elections or the House elections, because I can almost guarantee the Republican Party will not gain seats in the House if they're losing the presidential election. It just doesn't seem realistic. So I think Donald Trump will need a very solid victory if they are to move Alaska back into the safe Republican column on the Senate level. I'm expecting around a 15-point margin for Donald Trump. I think that this race will still go to Dan Sullivan. I still think that he will win re-election, but it is narrowing up, and the Republican Party is probably going to end up shifting focus to it sometime soon. It's obviously not going to be the main race. We probably won't see too much talk about it, but the Republican Party is definitely going to start redirecting a little bit more attention into a state that normally would be characterized as safe, because I used to characterize it as safe. A number of pundits also did as well, but after I guess a number of recent events, number one, with Donald Trump, a lot of races are starting to be characterized as likely, and I agree with that characterization for the state of Alaska itself. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Please consider joining as a member on my channel, and I will see you all tomorrow.